Who doesn't love a good story? I know I do. If I have not met you yet, my name is Todd. I serve here at Redemption on our Redemption Council, and it is a huge privilege just to get to be here with you this morning in this capacity up here preaching. Glad to be here with y'all. I'm just a sucker for a good story, always. Kind of the origins of my love for reading, right? So like anyone who knows me knows I have books all over the place. I have way too many books. I have books I haven't read yet. I love books and reading. And all of this started basically when I got sucked into a good story and I couldn't put the book down. I couldn't get out of the story. It brought me into it. It took me along the journey, and it just kind of did something inside of me. I just always love a good story. Some of my favorite music artists are just really good storytellers. When it comes to our approach to the Bible, I think storytelling is underrated. There are just some aspects of who God is that can only be revealed to us, at least us humans at least, through story. There are certain aspects of God where to really get the fullness of what is there, to get all of the richness and the detail of all the color and just all the richness of certain aspects of God, it really sometimes takes a story to get that across to us. Sometimes we prefer these direct propositional statements about God. God is love. We like these really direct statements, and so we love some of the New Testament letters where, Paul or Peter, whoever it is saying certain in prose form, right? Just direct statements about God, and they make this logical argument where you can kind of follow this way of thinking, and it's this point to this point to this point, and we love that, right? In the kind of Western world today, we love that kind of talking about God. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's in the scriptures, but I think there's a reason that narrative is the most common literary form in the Bible. Right, 43% basically of the Bible, roughly around there, is narrative. That's a big deal. I think that's telling us something. God reveals himself to us in stories because we humans are storytelling creatures. We tell stories to make meaning of the world and of our lives. And this is how it often works, right? At least when we come to Scripture, what happens is we follow the characters of a story. Okay, we kind of go on this journey with them, and we experience the world through their eyes, right? Through the lens of their experience. And what happens, right, is their experience of God reveals aspects of him we otherwise wouldn't fully kind of see or get. So what's fun about me getting to preach a just random sermon like this is I get to kind of have some freedom on what part of Scripture I want to preach on. We're not in a certain series right now. We just finished our series in Ephesians, right, that we've been in for several months now. We're about to start a new series here in the fall, but right now we're just in limbo almost. It's okay, Todd, what passage do you want to talk about? And so this is fun. This means I get to pick something that I personally am really passionate about and get excited about. So what happens with these types of sermons, these kind of standalone sermons, is I tend to gravitate towards the book of Genesis. I'm just noticing over the years that I keep doing that over and over again. There's not some intentional grand plan of why I do that. It happens. And so, right, why I love the book of Genesis, besides the fact that I think it's a good story, is it's foundational, right? So Genesis, literally, right, it sets up the rest of the biblical narrative. But it's foundational more than just giving us background information so you kind of know who some of these people are and you kind of know how to get to the rest of the story. It's foundational in a little deeper way than that. Actually, when you when you get the themes and the rhythms of the book of Genesis, you can like really start to get the themes and the rhythms of the rest of the story. It really contains the seeds of like the rest of the biblical narrative. And there is this hidden gem in Genesis that so many of us don't know a whole lot about. We don't hear about it very much. And I want to just put it on showcase here for you this morning and just hopefully let us like marvel at the mystery and wonder of God. It is the story of Hagar. Okay, so if y'all will get a Bible out here, turn with me to the book of Genesis, chapter 16. We just had this passage up here on the screen behind me with the reading that was just had. But really, I'm going to just kind of like walk us through the story. It might help you to like get a physical Bible. So in the seat in front of you, on the bottom of the chair, there's a Bible. Turn to Genesis 16. And we're going to let this story kind of take us along with it. So, okay, so just a quick disclaimer, right? I'm not a Hebrew scholar. Okay, so like this is not my day job. I don't do this all the time. I do have like some training in some of this stuff kind of in my previous life, but I'm not some like advanced Hebrew scholar who has like published articles and like all this stuff. But I know just enough to geek out on those who are scholars and to kind of get like overly excited about some of that stuff. The kind of person I kind of gleaned the most insight from here was Dr. Tony Maloof. He wrote a chapter here on Hagar in the book Vindicating the Vixens, Revisiting Sexualized, Vilified, and Marginalized Women of the Bible. Highly recommend this book. It'll like blow your mind. It's so good. Here's really what I want to do this morning. Here's my hope, is just to show, one, what the story of Hagar in Genesis reveals about God, right? So this is the story of Hagar, but really I think it's showing us something profound about who God is. And then two, just highlight maybe some implications for our personal stories and the way we show up in the world. So Genesis 16, we are introduced to Hagar, okay? She is Sarai's slave woman. Depending on what translation you're reading, it might say bondservant. This is slavery. She's a slave woman. Now, this is a little bit maybe different than how we think of modern day slavery in certain ways, but we don't need to shy away from the realities here, right? Hagar does not really have control over her own life, okay? She is basically, if you get down to it, a piece of property that's been purchased, right? Now, we know that's not who Hagar is, but that's the reality that she lives in, okay? So this is going to be a strange story in some ways, right? Because this is an ancient Near Eastern culture, okay? So this is thousands and thousands of years ago on the other side of the planet. Like this is, there are some things here that we often read right past or miss because, right, we just live in a very different time. So it's important to realize from the outset here that these ancient Near Eastern cultures, they are honor-shame cultures, right? So like social status is a really big deal, right? Your role in relation to who like determines so much of your life in this time. And so for Hagar, right, the text does not give us details. It doesn't tell us how this happened, how she became Sarai's slave woman. We do know in Genesis 12, just a few chapters before, that Abram and Sarai, I'm going to call them now Abraham and Sarah because it's easier to say, and that's all of us know that. Their names get changed here in just a few chapters in Genesis to Abraham and Sarah. They went on a sojourn in Egypt because of a famine. So we know they were in Egypt then, possibly. They purchased Hagar there because she's an Egyptian slave, right? So this is Hagar, okay? For all intents and purposes, kind of a nobody, okay? She's just kind of at the will and whim of Sarai and what she says she's supposed to do. She lives in these very particular confines. we also see that Sarah ends up saying, you know what, like maybe you can be more useful. Maybe you can help us by more than just doing your normal kind of slave duties. Maybe, right? Maybe you can help like bring about God's plan for our life. So far, God has showed up to Abram, right, and said, hey, you're going to have a child through your child. You're going to have these all these descendants. Your descendants are going to be so great, like look up at the stars, Abram. You can't even count all these stars. That's like going to be your offspring. And through you, I will bless the whole world. So in Genesis 12, we have this huge promise given to Abram, but it's not clarified really like how this is going to happen. Okay, so God just kind of says this and doesn't fill in all the details yet. Well, time goes on, and time goes on, and time goes on, and Sarai's like, I don't seem to be able to get pregnant. What are we doing here? Like, is this maybe, well, okay, maybe, I mean, God has provided a woman right here for us. Maybe that's how this is going to happen. So Sarai is working with kind of partial information here. And we see that Hagar is basically, right, used, so to speak. She's basically a means to an end. She's, okay, like Abram, you need to have this inheritance. Having children, having offspring, having an inheritance was a big, big deal for people in this time. Maybe that's how this is going to happen. And what we see right away here is so many of us come to a story like this in the Bible, and we come with certain presuppositions, certain assumptions. And right away, we start thinking things about Hagar. Right away, we maybe miss like how this actually reflects positively on Hagar's character. Okay, so Hagar is like chosen for this really important purpose. Now, she may not have had a lot of freedom to say no thanks, right? Like, I'm not trying to gloss over the difficult things here in the text, but also this is interesting that she is chosen for this. What happens here very often is in the history of just the history of the church and God's people, like very often you see Hagar vilified. You just see her being portrayed quite negatively. So there are some English translations of this passage in verse 4, for example. So we're in Genesis 16, verse 4, where it says that, okay, once Hagar realized that she conceived, okay, once Hagar realized that she's pregnant, that then she starts to look at her mistress Sarai differently, right? And some translations will say she looked on her with contempt, right? Like almost indicating or implying that there's an attitude of hostility, okay, that Hagar has towards Sarah. I don't know that the text really says that. The literal Hebrew translation here is basically that her mistress became little in her eyes. Right, we're reading from the New American Standard, the NASB this morning, that translation. It says that Sarah was insignificant in her sight. That is getting pretty close here. Basically, Hagar realizes all of a sudden, wait a minute, my status maybe is changing a little bit here, which would be a huge deal for her. And I don't know why any of us would fault her maybe being a little excited about that. Now, she then naturally, in a situation like this, what happens is, right, her view of her mistress Sarah starts to change a little bit, right? It starts to, basically what happens here is, I think, that the honor of Sarah, her mistress, the status and the honor that she had kind of becomes of smaller value in her sight, basically. which would be very kind of like disruptive. Once Sarah starts to pick this up and now we got some weird like dynamics going on, this would be very kind of like disruptive to Sarah's way of life and the whole setup of how they're doing everything. But when we assume right from the start, oh, Hagar is like, she's doing something like really evil or terrible towards Sarah, what it does is it frames the story of Hagar from the outset in a certain way, and then everything else we see in the text after it is colored by that. And so I'm spending some more time at the very beginning of this story just to say, hey, there actually might be some other ways to understand what's going on here. Because as we'll see, as we keep reading here and keep going through the story, we actually see that instead of painting Hagar as this like kind of like woman who caused a bunch of problems and who like, is someone to be maybe like looked down upon, we actually see Hagar honored in some astounding ways. So, right, the text is a little unclear here. Even if Hagar maybe had some pride here, again, I don't know how super clear that actually is in the text, but maybe if there's something there, it does not warrant the assumptions and the misinterpretations often made about her in the text, much less Sarah's treatment of her, right? So look at what happens here. Sarah, it says, treated her harshly, right? Some translations will say afflicted her. Okay, so this is the same Hebrew word that is used in the book of Exodus to describe how the Egyptians treated the Israelites when they were in slavery. Same Hebrew word. Okay, so it doesn't go into details of what happened here and what Sarah actually does to Hagar, but it's not good. It's not pretty. The text does not shy away from that at all. The author of Genesis is making sure we make this connection by using the same Hebrew word in the previous chapter, in chapter 15, when God predicts to Abram in a dream, right, about the affliction of his descendants in Egypt. Right, the author of Genesis has already told us that and has already set us up for that. So when we see this same word here in chapter 16 for how Sarah is treating Hagar, we're making that association and connection, okay? This is a little bit more clear in the text. Hagar is oppressed. This Hebrew word suggests the idea of bringing someone under control and dominion by means of harsh treatment. So Hagar, right, a purchased slave who is used for Sarah's plan, is vilified often by Bible readers and interpreters. She is oppressed here by Sarah, and now she flees and runs for her life. She is vulnerable, right? She is fleeing from her home into the perilous wilderness without anyone to take care of her or protect her. Right, not a good situation for Hagar, right? Are y'all tracking with me here? Like Hagar, this is really, really bad. But Hagar is not just a victim. God would not let this be her story. There is a shocking turn of events here because God appears directly to Hagar. Okay, I'm going to camp out here for a little while because this is mind-blowing. I cannot believe that this is not talked about more. Like even for myself as I was prepping for this and doing more study in these texts, I was like, wait, like I knew this was a big deal, but like how did I not know how big of a deal this is? Like, which is causing me to do some self-reflection myself, right? This is what happens here. We're gonna unpack it for a while, but this is huge, y'all. God shows up to Hagar. Now, in the text here, right, it says that an angel of the Lord appeared to her while she's by this well or this spring in the wilderness. So this angel of the Lord comes to find Hagar. This is verse 7, right? This is most likely God himself. I'm not going to spend a ton of time arguing for why that is, but there's a couple of things to look at here. Right, this is not uncommon in the Old Testament for God to show up like this to people, kind of this sudden, temporary appearance all of a sudden. Look at a couple of things, right? Look at what the angel, quote unquote, does here. This angel promises to multiply Hagar's offspring, right? It says your offspring is going to be basically like numberless. Like only God can do that, right? This is the same kind of language, by the way, for when God promises these numberless descendants to Abraham. Something to consider. Like the same type of language is used here for Hagar. When you look at Hagar's response at the end here, she gives God a name and she says God, you see me. Like her response indicates this isn't just like I saw an angel and therefore I think that there's something very direct and personal happening in this encounter. I think this is God himself showing up to Hagar. And in the Old Testament, you'll see this type of language of a messenger or angel, which very often, it sometimes really seems like God is actually showing up. So God comes to find Hagar in the wilderness. I love how it says this. He comes to find her. When this word find is used in the Hebrew Bible, I know I'm nerding out on Hebrew words, y'all, a little bit. I'm not pronouncing them, so I'm trying not to geek out too hard. But you have to kind of see how these words are used to get the significance of what's going on here. When this word find is used, this is basically, and I could go into grammar here and stuff, which I could do, but I'm not going to. This is the language of encounter and divine election. Okay, when God is the subject of a verb and the object of the verb is a person, this is, when this verb find is used, this is divine election. We see this in Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 89, Hosea chapter 12. Right, which begs this question, wait a minute, I thought only the descendants of Abraham and Sarah were God's chosen people. Yeah, if we look at the book of Genesis and then the biblical story overall, yeah, sure, we're going to see a lot of focus and emphasis on Abraham and his descendants, right? Absolutely. Why we miss the importance of what's happening here, though, is kind of disturbing to me, actually, a little bit. It really kind of shocks me. Right, in the story of Hagar, God is showing, even from the beginning, right, the word Genesis literally means beginning, that whose side God is on, whose side we think God is on, who you think God is for or against, is not as simple and black and white as we might think on a superficial, quick reading of the story here. There's more going on. There is beautiful hope that God gives to Hagar here, right? He shows up to her. He reveals that her child is a son, right? She knows she's pregnant, but she didn't know she's going to have a son. So God reveals this to her. This will be a son, and then your son will have a multitude of offspring. Okay, so now I need to clarify some stuff about Ishmael because we also misunderstand and misrepresent Ishmael a bunch here in the text. So, what happens is we kind of, and even the English translation, the NASB we read from this morning, kind of does this and makes it seem like, oh yeah, God shows to Hagar, makes this beautiful promise to her, but it's not going to be super great, and Ishmael's going to be difficult, and and then it keeps going, and it's wait, is this exciting? Are we glad about this? The whole tone of the text so far is Hagar is in a desperate, perilous situation. God shows up to her and says, hey, I will take care of you. He does say something strange of go back to Sarah, which is mysterious. Like, what is God doing here? But God is showing up and he is intervening here. He is doing something miraculous and beautiful here for Hagar. And I think he gives her hope. But we completely miss how hopeful this is for her. Like, in this moment, she is like, this is the last thing that she expected to happen. We miss that when we kind of see negative things about Ishmael here. But listen to this. Ishmael is named by God before his birth. Do you know how rare that is in Scripture? In the Old Testament, the only people this happens to, and this is in order of the text, Ishmael, Isaac, Josiah, and Solomon. The only people in the Old Testament who are named by God like this before their birth. And the name God gives him, Ishmael, literally translates to mean God hears. The Hebrew word there literally means God hears. Like, this is a blessing that God is giving to Hagar. This is amazing. This is mind-blowing. And then the text directly says, right, God says to her, I'm naming your son Ishmael because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Okay, now number 2, right? It says here that Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. Let's talk about that for just a minute. Naming someone like by an animal was common in this time. We have like 5 of Jacob's children who were later like named after animals. Okay, this is a normal thing. The whole meaning you take away from it is what type of animal is used. And actually, a wild donkey in this time, these nomadic tribes who lived in the desert, who herded camels and sheep and goats, a wild donkey was actually a envied and praised creature, actually, because it was free. It roamed free. We have an enslaved and powerless woman who is told that her son will be free and strong. And then there's even some debate among scholars about some of the language right after this, about the words of like Ishmael being against his brothers. Like, there's actually the literal translation basically means to dwell in the presence of his brothers. So scholars actually do not agree on some of this language. Man, if you're really following what's happening here, there's something really exciting, really hopeful here for Hagar. She will have a son who will be free and strong. Her descendants will be numberless. And look what happens next. This is such a deeply personal and profound encounter that Hagar names God. Y'all, like, Hagar is the only person in the Bible who gives God a personal name like this. Yes, God, like other people in the Bible, give God, they call God by his titles. And you also have God revealing a personal name to Moses in Exodus, right? So the Israelites know God as Yahweh. God reveals this personal name to them. But for a human being, a person, right, who is created by God, to name him a personal name like this, y'all, Hagar is the only one in the whole story of the Bible who does this. As I was prepping for this sermon, I was like looking stuff up and researching and going, is this right? Am I like missing something here? Like, no, like I'm not finding anyone else who's arguing this point. Why are we not talking about this more? God named Adam. Hagar named God. What does this say about God? Right? What does this reveal about him? She gives him a personal name based on her personal experience, and here is the name she gives to God. You are, the literal translation is, a God who sees me. A God who sees, or a God who sees me. When we miss the story of Hagar, we miss something about God. That he is the God who sees me. God elevates women in his work of redemption in some ways that might surprise us. He enfolds them into his plan and what he is doing to rescue the world in ways that we were not expecting. I'm going to circle back to this here in a bit because this name for God, this is actually why I wanted to preach on this passage. I just love this name for God, the God who sees me. There's something really personal and really powerful about that. But then as I got in here in the text and was studying, I was like, man, there is just so much other stuff here and so many implications for how we think about God and think about his plan for the world. If we keep moving through the book of Genesis, just a few chapters later, Genesis 21, what we see here is that God's seeing, right? His act of seeing Hagar, hearing her affliction, naming her son, God hears. This seeing, this hearing is active, right? It's anything but passive. So what happens is, right, Hagar goes back to Sarai's household. Ishmael is born. Ishmael is brought up and raised there in Abraham's home. But then we have Isaac, right, born. Sarah has a son finally named Isaac. And when that happens, the way that starts to unfold, Sarah then starts getting really upset about Ishmael not basically respecting Isaac more. And then she goes, hey, Abram, send her away. This is done. I'm not doing this anymore. And so Abraham goes, okay, I guess I'm going to have to right. He's caught between a power play between two women. He passively kind of does some things and says, okay, fine, I'll send you away. And they go into the wilderness, and Hagar and her son Ishmael, he's probably about 13 years old or so, we think. They are in the wilderness. Again, this is in Genesis chapter 21. They're sent off in verse 8 into the wilderness, and it gets so bad for them. They run out of water, and it's so bad that Hagar basically takes her dying son and puts him under a bush over here so she can be away from him and not watch him die of thirst. It is intense. And God shows up again and speaks to Hagar again and says, I will surely multiply your offspring. Go get your son. I will take care of him. He opens up her eyes and she sees this well of water all of a sudden, and God actually provides for them. When God hears the cry of Ishmael, when Hagar herself is unable to bear the cries of her son, God intervenes, right? His seeing, his hearing is not passive. It is active. He intervenes. He provides for them. He says, I will look after you. I will take care of you. This is the same type of language used in Exodus for when God heard the groaning of the Israelites in Egypt when they were in slavery. And if y'all track that story, you know that God's hearing of them was anything but passive. What does all this tell us about God? God identifies with the outcast, the marginalized, those who are vulnerable, those who are suffering. We see God's impartiality here on full display in Genesis, in the beginning of the story, where we don't need to wait to the New Testament to see how impartial God is. He elevates Hagar's status. He makes her the woman who named God and then promises her numberless descendants. This is subversive, right? This is transforming her status. This is disrupting the status quo. God chooses the so-called unchosen. He finds her. Now, just a quick side note. This is not the main focus. This is why I'm doing a quick side note. This is not the main focus in the passage, but I do think it's in here. We see implied God's grace for his imperfect chosen people, right? His chosen people, Abraham and Sarah. They are, some of their behavior here is inexcusable, okay? But God brings good out of their failure. Right? Praise God that he does not need us to be perfect to accomplish his plan of rescue for the world. Like, God really actually shows grace to Abraham and Sarah in some like pretty astounding ways here. But the main focus here of Genesis 16 and then this part of Genesis 21 is Hagar. What does this story of Hagar and Ishmael? Let me just ask a couple of questions here, if I may. What does this reveal about God's heart for all of humanity? Right? Especially those who are not his quote unquote chosen people, right? Abraham and his descendants. Can I ask it like a little bit more poignantly? Like, what are the implications of Hagar here? Her and Ishmael's story. Like, what are the implications for how we think and how we feel about what is happening in the ongoing crisis in Gaza today? Right, like in a situation where women and children are the most vulnerable. Like how does this story here and what it shows about God, how does that shape us? Like, what does it have to say to us? In Genesis 16 and 21, we see a God who sees, who hears a woman and a child who are dying in the wilderness. And what that means is he intervenes to take care of them. And you just heard my side note about Abraham, right? And God's grace to Abraham and Sarah. Okay, this is messy. Whoever, like, I am not trying to say, hey, we should now leave here with hatred in our hearts for certain people. Okay, whoever side you think God is on and who he's against and who he hates, this text and how this all plays out and the messiness of it all in the book of Genesis invites us to reconsider some things here. I want to circle back to this here in a few minutes and give us kind of a more like specific invitation to this. Before I do that, can I just kind of personalize this for some of us? Right, this is a very personal story here. The name Hagar gives God is deeply personal. The God who sees me. She names this well of water. The literal translation is like the well of the living one who sees me. Like, so it says it twice in there. This is deeply personal, right? What story? If you think about yourself for a minute, in your own life, in your own personal story, right? What story do you think you're living in? What's the story you tell yourself and you hear about yourself and your life? Whoever you are and wherever you are, God sees you and comes to find you. God is not passively waiting for us to come find him. He's not indifferent to our suffering. He comes to find us. This is what he has shown us in Jesus. Right? He comes to us. He becomes human like us. He was born of a woman like all of us. He experienced the same kinds of sufferings that we as humans suffer. And on the cross, he just shows us that there are no lengths that he will not go to come after us and to find us. And what this does is this now helps us. It empowers us to start to like retell the stories that we believe about ourselves. Right? There are two kingdoms at work here. In the first kingdom of evil here, this kingdom of darkness, it is at work to separate us from God and from his creation, from each other. This is what it does. So whenever we start taking this type of passage and go, oh, well, God must really like be upset at them and hate them, and there's some awful things coming for them, and we start all of a sudden like, we're missing that evil is actually already at work there. What evil does is it is at work to separate us. And what it does is it convinces us that we are unseen, that we are alone, that we need to be afraid, and that we're unworthy of being loved. Dr. Kurt Thompson is someone who I appreciate a bunch. He's a psychiatrist. He's been a psychiatrist for several decades. His work really kind of highlights how these types of emotional experiences, right, of feeling unseen, feeling alone, feeling unworthy, that these are basically one of the primary weapons that evil uses here to do this work. I think he is right on, because what happens is this literally starts to like rewire our brains and our nervous system in certain ways. So that literally when we start to be in certain types of situations, we almost by default start feeling these types of painful emotions, and then we like react and respond out of that. And literally it is like shaping us. And when you like look at some of the like neuroscience here and look at in particular what's called interpersonal neurobiology, it all starts to actually like track with this and the biblical story. And this is why God's act of seeing us, this is why God's act of coming to find us is so powerful. It literally starts to rewire our brains back to the way they are meant to go. Literally, it heals our emotions so that we start to experience and interpret them differently, all because we have a God who sees us. It transforms us and then how we relate to one another. Man, the hope that is here, y'all. Like God's light is shining in the darkness. And he's been doing this from the beginning. We see it in Hagar's story. His light shines in the darkness, and it's not because we're awesome. It's not because we have something to offer him. It's because this is who he is. This is what he does. This is what he's always been about and what he's always been doing. Right? This is deeply personal. And this like really internalizing this and taking this in will take some time, will take some work, right? So like I invite y'all to spend some time reflecting on this. The God who sees me. Like whenever you think of God, let this be one of the like first things that come into your mind. It will start to literally like reshape you in some ways. He's the God who sees me. And then as we wrap up here, what this does, y'all, is it really impacts how we show up in the world. We're invited to participate with God in this kingdom of love. Right? We, like God, we see those who are suffering. Right? We see the vulnerable, the women and the children who are suffering. This ongoing kind of crisis and war that's happening in Gaza. One of the ways I think that we can be a part of embodying hope to these most vulnerable people is by being generous with our resources, right? So all these words are great, but like when this starts to result in action and real like giving and real helping, this is powerful. Right, we've identified one of many good organizations that could provide right material assistance to people, particularly the kids who are suffering in the midst of an ongoing war. So I think the information is going to be here on the screen here behind me. This organization is called Save the Children. It's one of many great organizations here who are trying to do all this like relief work right now. So you can check out their website there, savethechildren.org. You can learn more about what they do. Right? If God is leading you by his Spirit to give here, right? And I'm not like presumptuous enough up here to know that's the case for you, so I'm not going to sit here and say that. But if God is leading you to do something here, I want to invite you to check out this website and to donate. This affects how we show up in the world. right? When we know the God who sees me, we start to care for the suffering of the people who God cares about, right? We start to thank God for his grace, for how we fail in this, and that he doesn't need us. But then we join him in his invitation, and we depend on him. We depend on his grace, his provision, his help.